Uh, Today we will have a look at 1 Kings, and we will look at the life of Solomon, then Adonijah, and a little bit about David from the first 14 chapters of First Kings. Okay, and we will try to look at the character of Solomon, the character of some of the people that are mentioned in the passages that we are studying, and we will try to get lessons for us to apply from these passages. Okay, chapter 1 of 1 Kings begins with David still on the throne, but he's an old man. His body cannot even remain warm with blankets around him, and he in a short while would be going the way of all humans. That is what David himself says, that is, he would be dying and going beyond life on the earth. And one of the things that we find is that the first crisis that comes up when he is still alive, and it becomes a threat to Solomon's the throne that God was going to establish through Solomon. His Solomon's brother Adonijah assumes that he can become a king and take steps to put himself on the throne. And the conflict arises as a result of David not clearly expressing what will happen after he dies, who will ascend the throne. He didn't make those things public, and as a result, certain events take place because of which Adonijah takes advantage of it. Okay, verse 1 says, David was very old and he could not keep warm, even though he put covers over him. Okay, then you find a little bit later in verse 5, now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward, put himself forward and said, I will be king. So he got chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never rebuked him by asking, why do you behave as you do? He was also very handsome and born next after Absalom. His elder brother Absalom had already tried to be king when David was in the prime of his life, and he had failed. He had been successful for some time and was deposed and was dead. And now Adonijah was moving in the same direction. A little bit is mentioned about him here. It says he was very handsome. Okay, and second thing we can know about him is that he could gather a crowd around him. He got chariots and people to run ahead of him, and he got himself ready to appoint himself as a king. He says, I will be king. Okay, this is not the way the Lord worked in Israel. People taking decisions on their own about what they will be and what they will be doing in life. Okay, so this is something we can also learn for ourselves. Uh, in the scriptures and in the history ahead of Adonijah was the fact that Saul had been appointed by God as king and then anointed by Samuel. In the same way, King David had been selected by God and anointed by Samuel. His brother Absalom had taken control by himself and had paid a price for it. Though there are scriptures and scriptural examples ahead of people, very often they make foolish decisions, decisions that are wrong, decisions that are contrary to God's word, decisions that are contrary to God's way of working, and they pay a big price for it. Okay, so let us also examine our own life to see whether there are things that we do in manner that is contrary to God. God always chooses people and empowers them, gives them the grace, the necessary grace, gives them the necessary gifting to carry out the task that he wants them to do. See, King Solomon was a king, a ruler, and the issue at stake is that of kingship. And it may look like a very secular kind of responsibility, but for God, there is nothing secular. He was going to choose, he was going to appoint, and he was going to anoint the king. Okay. Why was Adonijah behaving the way he was behaving? Okay. One of the reasons that is given there is his father, in other words, King David, never rebuked him by saying, "Why do you behave as you do?" Okay. David might have been busy. David may have had big responsibilities, may have had battles to fight, may have had administrative issues to deal with. And running a kingdom definitely requires a lot of effort and time. But it is also a responsibility that God has given to every parent to bring up and raise their children in the fear and knowledge of God. Here we find that David failed to rebuke his son or question him about his behavior. So it seems to be a pattern, it seems to be a practice. And Adonijah, who has grown up without anyone disciplining him, without anyone questioning him, now comes to a point in his life where he is in direct conflict with the way God deals with things. Okay. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 13, verse 24, it says, "He who spares the rod does not love the child. He who loves his child chastises him. He who spares the rod hates his son." Okay, disciplining children is a very important aspect of parenting. And David's failure to discipline and question the wrong behaviors in his child finally resulted in this young man taking up a position against God and the things of God. When a small child starts showing signs of bad behavior, it is important for parents to question, to rebuke, to set things right. Because at that point of time, they can be corrected, they can be molded, they can be shaped. But if the parent always thinks it's a small thing, chota problem hai, and leaves it uncorrected, then over a period of time, the small acts of disobedience, the small acts of indiscipline will become larger and larger. And at some point of time, it will be too late and too hard to correct. Okay. Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. Okay. So the Bible is very clear that foolishness is bound in the heart of children. Okay, they may look innocent, they may look weak, they may cry and weep and feel hurt when they are being disciplined. But then, if you need to remove the folly which is bound on their heart, then discipline must be exercised. Hebrews 12:6 shows that the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. So this is the way the Lord deals with us as well. Okay. So when the Lord also disciplines us, we must be careful not to express childish behavior by rebelling against him, getting offended by the discipline that he has in our life. Okay. Then the a terrible thing about Adonijah is that he takes things into his own hands to become a king. He was not appointed by God. He decides. Okay, Bible is very clear. Psalm 127:1. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders, they that labor in vain. Okay, unless the Lord guards the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. Okay, there is nothing on this earth that we can do without the hand of God supporting it, sustaining it, initiating it, and even bringing it to completion. Okay. Uh, Romans 8:31, if the Lord is for us, who can be against us? And like Brother P.T. Varghese has often said, if the Lord is not with us, then who cannot be against us? Okay, and Adonijah did not have the Lord with him, and so everything falls apart. Then we find in verse 7, Adonijah conferred with Joab son of Zeruiah and with Abiathar the priest, and they gave him their support. Okay. Last Sunday also I mentioned that the support of people who have the appearance of being closely associated with God does not mean that God is with them. Okay. So Abiathar the priest was wrong. Joab the commander, who had commanded so well and led the armies of David, was also wrong. And having the support of these mighty men or people of renown was of no use. Okay, there were others who were opposed to him: Benaiah, Zadok, Nathan, Shimei, and the king's bodyguards. They were all against him. But at the same time, the support of a few people was there with him. But support does not mean God's approval. Okay, and ambition versus God's plan. This is one thing that I want each one of us to see. Sometimes in life, we want to be something, we want to become something, but we must ask whether that is exactly what God wants us to be. Here, Adonijah wanted to be a king, but that was not what God had in purpose for Adonijah. He had another king in mind, King Solomon. Okay. Uh, eh, and God will empower those whom He chooses. God chose Solomon for succession to the throne. Daniel chapter 4, verse 17 and 32 also speak about how God places kings and is sovereign in raising up people. So we need to keep that in mind. Solomon's elevation shows how God elevates those whom he has chosen. Okay, the word Solomon means peaceful. It's a variant of shalom, and he was one of many children. Okay, we are going to look at Solomon's character also to some extent. He was one of many children who grow up, and King David, his father, had many wives, and he also had many children. Okay, so parental attention may have been not very great even for Solomon, and because he was Bathsheba's son, people both in the palace and in all the kingdom would have known how his father David had actually eliminated Bathsheba's husband to become to take her to his palace. Okay, but Solomon may have got the best education that was possible in all of Israel because of his being the king's son. Okay, that is a little bit about his background. Then, after King David died, there are some things which Solomon does. It is mentioned in chapter 2. He quickly eliminates Joab, Shimei, and Adonijah, people who were opposed to his father and opposed to his coming to the throne. All these people he eliminated. And he even had the priest Abiathar, who is mentioned as a descendant of Eli. He sidelines him and sends him back to his farm. Okay, and very quickly Solomon takes charge of situation in the kingdom once he is placed on the throne, and he establishes it, removing all those who are a threat and those who are opposed to his father David. Then The second thing that we see uh, about Solomon is that he was very wise. Okay, and in fact, the Bible tells that, yeah, he was wiser than anyone else on the earth. Okay, and wisdom is basically practical application of knowledge and experience. Each one of us, we know a lot of things. We study a lot, we read a lot, we hear a lot through newspapers, TV, and even through magazines, and through our college and school education. We know a lot, and then life gives us a lot of experience. We see people, deal with people, we see things, and we see how things behave. Many things we know and many things we experience, but wisdom is the application of both experience and knowledge in a way that is useful and beneficial, and in the best possible way. Okay, so, Solomon, when it says was wise, it means that God had given him practical wisdom. In chapter 3, verse 1, we find, let's turn to chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Okay, so we will deal with this marriage later on. But first, we must know that Solomon was given the grace by God to construct the temple, construct a huge and beautiful palace, which was appreciated by people from across the globe who visited him. And also, he built a wall around Jerusalem. Okay, on Sunday, we saw how God had given peace on all sides for Solomon. Okay, by subduing his enemies through his father David. So when Solomon ascended on the throne, there was practically no problem. Okay, and he had the freedom to establish the temple, the palace, and build the walls, and huge construction activities were there. Okay, then we also see that God made Solomon wise. Okay, in chapter 3, we find uh, verse 5 onwards, where Solomon offers a sacrifice to the Lord, 1,000 burnt offerings. Okay, Solomon was always lavish in the way he offered things to the Lord. It was never small things. Here you find him offering 1,000 burnt offerings before the Lord. And that night when he is asleep, God appears to him in a dream and converses with him. Okay, what is a dream? A dream is something almost all of us would have experienced. Scientists have tried to find out what a dream is like. This is what is taught in colleges and believed, okay, by scientists, that there are two levels in which a person sleeps. When a person falls asleep, he goes into one phase of sleep, then he goes into a deeper phase of sleep. And during the deeper phase of sleep, actually with his eyelids closed, the eyeballs start rotating. It is called as rapid eye movement sleep, and it is in this phase of sleep that a person has dreams usually. Okay. Anyway, during the dream that King Solomon had, God asked him what he would like to have. Okay, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Okay, then Solomon answered. Solomon's answer tells us about what was there on the heart of Solomon. Yeah, many believe that actually most of the dreams that we have are activities or that we are thinking about during the day, or some things that we are worrying about. Those are brought out and in the form of dreams. Okay, so when God asks Solomon, what would you want? Solomon has this reply. You have shown great kindness, verse 6, chapter 3, to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on the throne this very day. Okay, verse 7, this is what he asked. Now, the Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father, but I am only a child. Okay, so Solomon acknowledges before God in the dream that he's only a child and he does not know how to carry out his duties. There is a sense of humility. I am so young. I am not really having the know how or knowledge or the experience to carry out my duties. Verse 8, your servant is here among the people you have chosen. He realizes that he is king not of just a country like any other kings, but he is the king in a country among a people whom God has chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. It's a huge population. So, coming along with it is a big responsibility. This is what Solomon realizes. So, he says in verse 9, give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? He recognizes that his responsibility is God given. He realizes the people over him he is made king, they are God's people. He realizes that he is small. He realizes that he doesn't have the necessary skills or the abilities, and so he prays, asking for wisdom to govern, so that he will be able to discern in his heart what is right and wrong, and so he is able to govern the people correctly. Okay, the Lord, it says in verse 10, was pleased with Solomon and said, say, two things God tells him. I will give you what you have asked, and I will give you what you have not asked also. God says, since you did not, since you asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies. Okay, there were three things which people normally ask. They ask for their enemies to be eliminated, they ask for wealth, okay, or they ask for, okay. Instead of asking for these two things, he had asked for wisdom. So God says, because of that, I will give you what you have asked. Okay. Then what you did not ask also, I will give you. He says, wealth and honor also. Verse 13 says, moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. Okay. So God gave him two things, what he asked and what he did not ask. When we look at Solomon's prayer, it asks us to examine what kind of prayer we have. Very often, we tend to pray asking for physical things for ourselves. You know, give me better education, give me a better home, give me a good wife, give me this, give me that, give me promotion, give me increment, give me stability during my retirement. It is things for ourselves that we ask. Or if somebody is troubling us, we pray that God should somehow deal with that situation. Okay, but God says here very clearly, these are two things that Solomon did not ask. His concern was not about himself. His concern was not about how he will sustain his throne. His concern was more about God's people, how he will execute the responsibility that God has given him on the earth. Okay, so God has placed each one of us into different kinds of relationships. We may be a son We may be a daughter, we may be a father or mother, we may be a husband or wife, we may be a boss or subordinate, we may be owning something, we may be the secretary of the society that we live in. We have various responsibilities. So God appreciates our asking of wisdom for fulfilling the responsibilities that we have been given, the responsibilities and relationships that God has given us. We may not be equipped, we may not be qualified to discharge those responsibilities, but God appreciates if we ask Him for wisdom. Yeah, that is what is written in the book of James also, isn't it? If anyone lacks wisdom, James 1 5, then he should ask God, who gives generously and without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Okay, so if we lack the wisdom to do our studies well, if we lack the wisdom to carry out our responsibilities in our office, or we lack the skills to even handle the technology of the day, whatever it may be, a weakness, okay, we need not worry about it. We need not ask selfish things, but we can ask God to help us to execute the responsibility that He has given, and He will give it. Not just what we ask for, but way beyond what we ask for. Uh, in the model prayer that the Lord taught, okay, Matthew chapter 6, verse 9 to 13. We are not going to study it, but we can have a look at that passage to understand the prayer that was taught by the Lord, to understand what He appreciates when we pray. Matthew 7 7, ask and you shall be given, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened unto you. Okay, so God wants us to pray. God wants us to communicate. Here in Solomon's case, everything is happening in a dream. Uh, God speaking to him, Solomon's response, God granting him the things, his wisdom, and so on and so forth. Everything happens in a dream. The very fact that it came in a dream shows that that was his concern. That was what preoccupied his mind throughout the day. How am I going to do this job that God has given me? Okay. And in the Bible, in the New Testament, we are told how God has chosen us, the foolish things of the world, in 1 Corinthians, chapter 1, to shame the wise. And we were not wise when we were chosen. So we need to pray. God has chosen us. He will empower us. He will give us the enabling to do it. Okay. Then in chapter 4, we find Solomon appointing officials. Okay. God has given him wisdom, and I'm sorry, we also look at a wise decision he gives immediately after that. That is given in the second part of chapter 3, when two prostitutes come before King Solomon. Both of them claim to have given birth to a child. One child dies, and then King Solomon is asked to decide who is the child belonging to. And then he gives a wise decision. And in verse 20, he orders that a sword be brought so that the child can be cut into two, and the real mother says, don't cut, give the child to the other woman. Whereas the other woman says, it's okay, you divide the child into two. And King Solomon hands the child to the true mother. Okay. And in the last verse of chapter 3, we are told, when all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe, because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. He had wisdom from God. So people were now no longer thinking of Solomon as someone who was born wise, smart, but they understood that he had wisdom that was purely and specifically given by God. In the New Testament, we find examples very much like that. When the disciples, especially Peter and James and John and Andrew, when they were arrested and the Jewish leaders questioned them, and the answers that they received from these people who were illiterate, untaught, uneducated fishermen, the crowd was stunned. The Jewish leaders were stunned. They understood and they realized that they had been with Jesus, and their wisdom came not from their own study but through their interaction with the Jesus Christ. Okay, and if people look at you or me and find human wisdom reflected in it, there is not much appreciation that will be there. But when people see that the decisions we take are in line with what God would be doing, they also will learn to appreciate, and they will understand that the hand of God is in the wisdom that one possesses. And the people held the king in awe. Okay, that would have made people submit to the rulings and decisions of King Solomon in all the decisions he took subsequent to this. Okay, in chapter 4, we are told very beautifully, we won't read it, but he appoints various leaders who will do the administrative job to bring in the food and make sure that the people are in his palace and in the city of Jerusalem get their regular rations of food, and there is plenty and no shortage or want. Okay, so chapter 4 shows how Solomon's wisdom helps him in managing the affairs of the city and of the kingdom. Then in the same chapter, verses 29 to 30, chapter 4, verses 29 to 30, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand of the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the east and greater than the wisdom of Egypt. So the wisdom that God gave Solomon is compared, and it surpasses the wisdom that was found in the knowledgeable communities in the nearby areas. Egypt had a huge library, and Alexandria was the center of learning in Egypt. Okay, and far greater than that kind of knowledge was displayed by Solomon. Verse 3 says he was wiser than anyone else. It names a few people there. We may not know them, but they must have been famous in that time. He was wiser than them. Verse 32 says he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and over 1,005 songs were composed by him. So he was a songwriter. He was someone who composed proverbs, words of wisdom for others to follow. Then verse 33 is astonishing. His knowledge of botany was astounding. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows on the walls. Okay, then his knowledge of zoology was also astonishing. He spoke about animals and birds and reptiles and fish. And in verse 34, it says, from all nations people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So in all the sciences that were there, Solomon excelled, so much so that people from across the globe sent their delegates to meet Solomon so that they could listen to him and become like him if possible. They could emulate him in some way. Okay, since Solomon was not an evolutionist, okay, and the wisest man on the earth was a believer in God as creator. So this is something that we can remember. Then in the beginning of the next chapter, we are presented with the king of Tyre, who allies with Solomon and supplies him with many materials that were required for the construction of his palace and the construction of the temple. And he gives craftsmen and wood and many other things to support him. Tyre is the place where a biblical prophecy, astonishing biblical prophecy, is there in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26, which talks about how Tyre will be destroyed. And when you get time, you can read it. Every single word which is there in that prophecy has come true. It talks about how Tyre will be destroyed, how the top of the city will be scraped and only rocks will be seen. It will become a place for spreading of fishing nets and so on and so forth. And we find that in history, both Nebuchadnezzar and King Alexander the Great played a big role in actually fulfilling these prophecies word for word. Okay, but at the time of Solomon, the king of Tyre and the nation of Tyre, the Phoenicians were a very powerful and wealthy nation. Trading had made them very rich. Okay, and this is something that we can remember. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 5, we find they offered so many sheep and cattle that it could not be counted. Okay, so for Solomon, his spiritual life was always expressed in putting burnt offerings before the Lord, and there was a deep sense of responsibility and relationship with God. And what he did became an example for the people of Israel as well. And we find that when the temple is dedicated, so much offering is brought that the burnt offerings could not be held on the brazen altar which was there. And they actually dedicated the place around it so that it could be, the offerings could be offered on the in the courtyard. And there was great renewal and revival under King Solomon. Okay, then you find Solomon's prayer when the temple is dedicated. You can find that in chapter 8. I will just briefly highlight some of the points that were there in the prayer. Last Sunday, we have already seen that Solomon was very clear that God would not reside in the temple, but God was everywhere and could not be contained in the temple. But he prayed that God should hear people when they came there to offer their sacrifices to restore their relationship to God, and he should answer their prayer from heaven and hear them. Okay, then there were some aspects of it, 8 things that he prayed for. Verse 30 of chapter 8 says, when you hear us, forgive us. Okay, so sin and forgiveness of sin was something that Solomon wanted to be part of the lifestyle of the people of Israel. They would come to the temple, offer their sacrifices, confess their sins before God, and God should hear and forgive them. In verse 31, he prayed for justice to be delivered. Justice was always there on his mind, even when he gave the verdict to those two prostitutes in a situation that looked impossible to resolve. Okay, even today, high courts and supreme courts and judges have given so many wrong decisions because they have not been able to discern what is right and wrong. But Solomon prayed that God should enable justice to be delivered among his people. In verse 33, he talks for when they are defeated at the hands of their enemies because of their sin, God should hear them when they cry out to them. Then he talks about in verse 35, when it doesn't rain due to the sins of people, then God should hear them when they pray. Then in verse 31, he talks of when there is famine or plague or locust, or if enemies besiege their city, then when anyone prays, okay, he is very clear that even if one person prays, then God should hear and answer. This he says in verse 38. And then in verse 41, when a foreigner prays, who is living among them, any foreigner prays to the living God, then he prays that God should hear and give the foreigner whatever he asks for, so that God's name will be glorified. Many times we don't pray like that for the people in our midst who do not know the living and true God, but he did. In Ebenezer, where I lived in Bombay, I remember some of the leaders in our building also, no, spiritual leaders. We had two gates in our building which connected two different directions. So people would like to take a shortcut through our building when they went to another direction. But some of the leaders of the churches that were there inside Ebenezer would obstruct. They would stop people from going. They never thought that it was an opportunity to give tracts, to give the gospel, to share the good news. Okay, they looked at it as someone encroaching on my property. Okay, but here you find King Solomon actually praying for the foreigners that God would hear them, and he was concerned. Then he says, when you send your people to war against enemies, be with them. Okay, in verse 44. And in verse 46 to 48, he says, when people sin against you, they repent, they turn to you, please, and they have a change of heart, do hear them. Okay, this was Solomon. He started very well. He started beautifully. He moved in the right direction. And under his reign, the nation prospered. People prospered. Everyone became wealthy. It says, like, silver was so common in the nation. Silver was so common. Cedar was just another common commodity in Israel. Okay. Uh, but we find that this wealth and prosperity and peace that came was not everything. Solomon started good, but there were things that were wrong. There were things that he did not check. There were things that he did not correct. And these things finally became a snare in his life. And as he progressed, he also ruled for 40 years in Jerusalem. But during those 40 years, towards the end, everything started falling apart. Even the peace that his nation enjoyed was gone, and everything started collapsing in his home, in his personal life. And he, as a leader of the nation, everything started collapsing. So, when we look at our lives as we are growing up and aging in our life, it's a question that many of us have. No, things are not as good as it is. It is simply because there are many things we have ignored as we moved from childhood to teens, and teens to youth, to young adulthood, and married life, and then now close to or beyond retirement. And these things that we ignored are now becoming sore points in our lives. Okay, chapter 10 and 11 capture the last moments of Solomon's life, and we will briefly look at them. In chapter 10, verse 23, it says, his riches and wisdom were greater than that of other kings, and people sought audience with him. Everyone brought gifts. In verse 26, it says, Solomon accumulated chariots, 1,400 of them, and horses, 12,000 of them, which he kept them in Jerusalem and in cities that were dedicated for holding these chariots and horses. Okay, so verse 26 is something that we need to look at. He accumulated chariots and horses. What's wrong with having chariots and horses? Okay, verse 27 says the silver was as common as stones in Israel at that time, and cedar as common as sycamore figs. Okay, in Deuteronomy 17:16, when you read this verse, you will understand what was wrong with having chariots and horses. This is way before the first king was anointed. It is the time when Moses was also there. And here the Lord is telling through his servant, chapter 17, verse 16 of Deuteronomy, you must not, the kings must not acquire chariots. It talks of a time in the distant future when Israel will be led by kings. Then there are instructions that are written in the book of Deuteronomy for kings to follow. And this is one of the instructions that is given. They must not acquire chariots or make his people go to Egypt to get more of them. Okay? Or they must not go to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. So God did not want his people to go back to Egypt, even for getting chariots, even for getting horses when they became rich and wealthy, and they could stand face to face to that powerful kingdom without being slaves anymore. But God wanted to remember that they were rescued from the dark kingdom of Egypt and brought into a land flowing with milk and honey. Slaves had been set free, and he didn't want them to go back into that situation again. Okay. Chapter 10, verse 28 says, Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt. Chapter 10, verse 29 says, his chariots came from Egypt. Solomon was living in direct disobedience to the commands of God. Okay. In our own life, when we examine, there will be a migration. When we come to know the Lord, there are so many bad things we give up, and everything becomes new in that beauty of that born again experience that we have. And we give up so many things. But later on, when as a result of our obedience, God brings blessings into our life, and we take the things of God for granted. Then we go back and dig into the sins of the past and bring them back, and then we thrive and thrill in the glorious past that actually reminds us and brings us into a bondage like the one that was there before we came to know the Lord. Okay, so God was not happy with Solomon because he was disobeying. Then the second major area where Solomon fell was the many wives that he had, and for the many pagan wives that he had. Okay, in chapter 11, verse 3, it says he had 700 wives, all of noble birth, and 300 concubines. So it seems very likely that Solomon thought that to have peace, he needed to have alliances and treaties. And what better way to have an alliance and treaty than to marry someone from a different kingdom so that there would be no war. Okay, so he married many women, many foreign wives, and these are in direct conflict with the instructions given in Deuteronomy 17, okay, verses 17, where it says he must, this is a reference to what will be the situation when kings rule over Israel. This is something which God told Moses. He must not marry many wives or his heart will be led astray. This warning was already there in scriptures, but Solomon ignored it. Okay. God made him wise, which means he had practical wisdom, but his wisdom, when it was devoid of God's guidance, then he lived it the way he wanted, and he married many contrary to God's views. In Deuteronomy 7:34, it talks about the nation of Israel as a whole. They must not marry the locals whom God had displaced. So God was against marriage with those who did not belong to the covenant. And Solomon violated everything. He may have had many reasons for his violations, but those violations finally costed him a lot. In chapter 11, verse 4, it says, his wives turned his heart to other gods. He was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. Okay, so over a period of time, slowly but steadily, his spirituality declined and he was drifting far from God. Initially, the drift is not seen and can't be measured, but as time went by, it was very evident for everyone. Okay, he followed Ashtoreth, Molech, and Chemosh. These were abominable gods that the pagans around them worshipped. And Solomon personally started worshipping these idols. He became a secular king. He turned a theocracy into a chaotic, people-centered, people-choice-oriented nation. Okay, people could choose their own gods. His wives could decide what they worshipped, and he, by accepting and practicing everything, wanted the world to feel that he was a tolerant king. Okay, but that was not what God wanted. God wanted him to be salt and light. God wanted him to be a witness. God may have placed many of us in positions of authority in our offices, where we take decisions on behalf of the company, or the college or school, or we are given classrooms with a lot of students under us. Okay, and God wants us to be upholding the things that are dear to his heart, and not to appear accommodative just so that we become popular with the masses around us. Okay, what was the consequences? Just a few thoughts, and we will be through. In chapter 11 verse 9, it says God was angry with Solomon. Okay, in chapter 11 verse 11, God says the kingdom will be torn away from your descendants. Okay, God wanted to do it then, but he said, because of your father David, I won't do it as long as you are alive. But when you are gone, it will be torn away from your sons. In fact, the biggest chunk went away from following the family of his descendants. Okay, then in chapter 11 verses 14, 23 and 26, we are told how God raised adversaries. God had brought peace to him. Now God raised enemies for him. Okay, Hadad the Edomite, Rezin the son of Eliad, and Jeroboam the son of Nebat, his own official. All these people turned against him. And towards the end, he had a great difficulty managing things within the country and managing the enemies outside his country. Finally, Solomon died after having ruled a united kingdom for 40 years. But after his death, the kingdom divided, and his children and the descendants after that paid a big price because of Solomon's unfaithfulness. They always had to struggle with idolatry. They had to struggle with pagan gods being worshipped. They had to struggle with believers being persecuted, and unbelievers taking control of things. And the kingdom would deteriorate slowly but steadily. And finally, God would have to abolish the throne, and take and give it off into the hands of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Okay, with that, we will close for today.